Then I'm going to introduce our panelists this evening, and we'll get into the program. On the far left, Paul Johnson. That happens to be where he's sitting. Doesn't necessarily mean anything else, just where he's sitting tonight. Paul Johnson is an organic market gardener and the lobbyist for the Kansas Rural Center on regional foods, environmental protection, water issues. Since 1980, he has also advocated in Topeka on poverty, social services, energy conservation, and local food issues. His weekly Policy Watch reports during the Kansas legislative session are a must-read for anyone who wants to keep up with legislative action in environmental and social issues. KRC sponsors monthly conference calls on grazing options to promote sustainable agriculture and has a pollinator project promoting farming practices to increase ecological balance. The center has been active in promoting federal farm bills that support conservation practices on working farms through the Conservation Stewardship Program. On the far right, Ron Flataski, Executive Director of Audubon of Kansas, has been involved in advocating for wildlife conservation in many capacities. Having grown up on a diversified farm and still involved in land management for ALK's sanctuaries and his own family land, Ron's priority has always been stewardship of the natural world. As a member of the USDA Kansas State Technical Committee since the mid-1990s, he brings his passion to improve policies and practices involving the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, Conservation Reserve Program, and easement programs to preserve grasslands, wetlands, and other habitats. And in the center, Don Teske is currently and for the last 16 years president of the Kansas Farmers Union. He is the fifth generation to live and work on the family farm on the eastern edge of the Flint Hills. The farm's terrain is rough and rocky with about 2/3 in grass and about 1/3 planted to row crops on the bottoms and very tops of the hills. The grasses are native blue stem and brome utilized through a cow-calf herd. Crops he raises include soybeans, green sorghum, red clover, wheat, oats, and more. Don also serves as the VP on the National Farmers Union Board of Directors, which provides guidance to state chapters on various aspects of the federal farm bill. Additionally, he serves on several other boards related to ag issues. We really appreciate having these three gentlemen here this evening, and I'm going to find out who's going to start. Paul's going to start. Whoops.
Well, I'm going to take a shot at some of the broader issues of the Farm Bill, and then Don and Ron can fill in some of the specifics of the conservation programs that I don't work with as much. You know, we pass farm bills every 5 or 7 years. We had one in 1996, 2002, 2008, 2014. The question is, when's the next one coming? Is it in 2018, 2019? So the debate's on and what money's going to be available and what political trade-offs will make to get this dysfunctional Congress operating to make some of these decisions. I think there's a couple overriding big issues that I think about when I think about the Farm Bill. One is that we have a Farm Bill. What we don't have is a Farm and Food Bill in our country. I'm going to get into that a little bit about the fact that we subsidize only a handful of crops. We don't subsidize a healthy diet, and we really don't have a food debate in this country to go along with the Farm Bill. The other reality is that farm bills are really the key agricultural policy in our country. At state level or county levels, we don't do much with agricultural policy. So whatever happens with the Farm Bill really dictates how the vast majority of the land in our state is used and the kind of crops and the kind of efforts and risks that farmers take at this point. And I know I wanted to get this PowerPoint, and I apologize that the computer can't talk to some of the other technology here. So you're going to have to bear with me on a couple of handouts that I want to hold up and talk about a little bit. what is the Farm Bill? Well, 80% of the Farm Bill is nutrition programs. And then 5% is commodities, 8% is crop insurance, 6% is conservation, and then 1% goes for everything else that's in the Farm Bill. And I know we're not here to talk about the nutrition programs tonight, and I need to say a couple items about that. In November of 2015, the Kansas Health Institute, which is an independent health think tank in Topeka, did an analysis of hunger in our state. And what it showed is that 1 out of 6 households in our state are food insecure. And really the questions are at the end of the month, that last week, is there enough food for people to feed themselves at this point? And unfortunately, the last 2 years since 2015, our state legislature's passed a couple pieces of legislation that punish the poor even more in terms of access to food stamps for folks and access to public assistance for families in our state. Now the question is, and right now there's 240,000 Kansans, a little less than 1 out of 10 Kansans are living with food stamps. It's really the way that you make up for minimum wage employment in our state. I mean, it's basically part of the salvation to keep people afloat and being able to feed themselves at this point. Now the question is, what's going to happen with the budget for the Farm Bill, and what's going to happen to the budget for food stamps? If Trump had his way, and God knows we don't think this thing's going to fly, by 3 years from now, Kansas would have to fund 20% of the food stamp program. Right now, the benefits are 100% federal. That'd be $60 million our state would have to come up with to just keep the food stamp program at an even level. Question is, are they going to block grant the food stamp program? We saw what happened with TANF and AFDC when they block granted that, and that's been a disaster. If the block grant comes through the food stamps, I think you could really count on cuts to, especially for children. It's probably, it's our largest feeding program for children in our state. Now the question is the politics of this. Is the Farm Bill going to move before all the other hysteria that's going on in Congress at this point? And some of the advocates are thinking that we may actually get some committee hearings in November and December and try and push through a minimal bipartisan effort to get that out of the way for all the other problems with the debt and ceiling, et cetera, the budget, et cetera. I think a lot of the advocates, though, think that while we may get some committee hearings, we might get some agreement on it, and most of those committee hearings would be no cuts to the food stamp program, and we wouldn't block grant it, and we wouldn't make 25% cuts to the Farm Bill, which Trump asked for in his budget. It's doubtful it'll ever get any floor action or anything moved before the end of the year. Now, I said that we have a farm, but not a food bill. And I hope that you can see this. This is the USDA food plate in our country. Half of this food plate is fruits and vegetables. Another quarter is grains, whole grains, hopefully, protein, and dairy. That's what the ideal nutrition diet should be in our country. So let me show you what the agricultural subsidy food plate looks like in this country. 2/3 of the agricultural subsidy food plate is feed grains. It's for meat and dairy, soybeans and corn, etc. And then you've got 20% for food grains. You have 15% for starch, oil, ethanol, etc. You have 2% for nuts and legumes, and you have 1% for fruits and vegetables. Whereas the plate is, half our plate should be fruits and vegetables, 1% of our farm programs go for that. I was hoping that we could catch up with an internet access because there is a website that I think is really worth going to look at. It's called the Environmental Working Group. I'm sure many people in this audience have heard of that group. 20 years ago, they went to federal court and sued to get access to federal farm payments as public records in our country. So if you go to farm.ewg.org, it has all the farm payments made in the country the last 20 years. And if you've got a farmer's name that you want to enter into it, so to find out what Uncle Joe's getting in terms of farm subsidies, etc., you can do that. You can get an idea of that. What it shows for Kansas, when you get to that point, is that over the last 20 years, our state has gotten $18.5 billion in farm subsidies. So where's that money gone for? Most of it has gone for the commodity program, 9.7, so it's about half of it. Another 40% has gone for crop insurance subsidies, and then you get to conservation programs, and then you get to disaster relief. So that's how we pass out $18.5 billion to our farmers for the last 20 years. The problem with this, in essence, is that it goes to, the vast amount of the money goes to our largest farmers. That for commodity payments, which is half of all the farm payments, the top 10% of our farms get 72% of the benefits. The top 20% of our farms get 87% of the benefits, and our last 80% of farms get 13%. So we have farm programs that are geared to the largest farms that are going to keep them getting larger, unfortunately. A couple comments about the conservation portion to this. Kansas has gotten $2.6 billion in the last 20 years for conservation payments. 90% of that has gone for the CRP program. It's called the Conservation Reserve Program. And it's a 10-year contract that farmers sign where they're idle land from production for that. And then, so that's 90% of it. That's 2.4 of the 2.6 billion. Then the other 200 million is spread over a couple other programs that the Rural Center and the National Sustainable Ag Coalition, a lot of people have fought hard for. One of them is instead, CRP is really for land retirement. It's take it out of production, put it, and it's a good thing. I'm not arguing that we need it for buffers, we need it for wildlife habitat, for a lot of reasons. So, but what the Rural Center people, what we've worked on is conservation programs for working farms. And that's called the Conservation Stewardship Program at this point. But it's capped. We don't have enough money or enough acres permitted to, we can only handle half of the contracts that farmers in Kansas came forward last year to ask for assistance. You're talking about buffer strips, crop rotations, fencing off ponds, basically soil improvement. And only half of the people who requested it could get it because of the limited funding at this point. The other program that it's kind of a mixed bag is called the EQIP program. And it's the Environmental Quality Incentive Program. Is that right? Tough to stay up with all these acronyms at times, but the good news with that is that it has some organic pieces to it. That's how I got some funding for my high tunnel to put on my 40-acre farm up in Jefferson County. And it does a lot of environmental stewardship. That's part of it. The other part goes for helping CAFOs, helping with manure and that for large animal operations. And I guess they need some help, and I guess, we want them less polluting at this point, at this time. I mentioned NSAC. I'm going to end with that and turn this over because at some point we'd like to get into some policy debates about what kind of improvements we would like to see in the Farm Bill at this point. But the Rural Center has been involved with the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition for 25 years. It's about 120 groups across the country that's working on it. And if you're looking for information on what's happening with the Farm Bill, what's going to happen with the beginning farmer, what's happening with organic research, what's happening with conservation stewardship program, disadvantaged farmers, it's the site that you can get weekly reports from them as to how the Farm Bill is going to roll out in the next couple of years. And it's sustainableagriculture.net. It is the website at this point. And when we get into discussions of policy, as we will, I'm hoping we can talk about limitations on commodity payments and crop insurance for the larger farms. I want to see an expansion of CSP so that we can pay people for stewardship practices on the farm, and that can be a part of their base income for more diversification in our country. And my Lord, we've got to get away from subsidizing only 5 crops in the Farm Bill. Corn, wheat, soybeans, cotton, and rice is where all the subsidies go for, and start subsidizing a healthier diet that we need for our state and our country. Thank you.
Am I going next?
Might as well.
All right. Evening. I hope I don't offend anyone if I said here I'm old and fat. Any members of the congregation in the crowd here? Nobody? My cousin Gary Teskey was pastor here for many, many years, so he's actually one of my relatives, I claim. From what Joyce sent to me tonight, she asked me to kind of start by kind of saying how I got to where I'm at, and then the biggest problem I see with making a good farm bill. And I farmed there with my father and uncle and grandfather. When I was big enough to crawl on a tractor, I was going, and then farmed full-time from 1973 until 1994. And then in 1994, I was offered and accepted a part-time position at Kansas State University as a farm financial analyst, and I traveled the state and helped farmers through crisis situations and to improve their books and deal with their creditors and et cetera. That was stressful but rewarding. Then in 1995, Dan put out a call for a field analyst for Rural Center, and for some dumb reason they picked me. So from 95 to 2000, I worked for the Kansas Rural Center, and that's when I got to know Paul. And then in 2001, I was elected to the presidency of Kansas. And I told him I wouldn't do it more than 5 years, but here we are. Paul mentored me at the State House. I think he still considers me a complete failure, but I appreciate everything he's done over the years. And so that's kind of my life story in a nutshell, except I got a good wife who put up with me all this time, and we got 4 kids and 6 grandkids and a 7th in the oven. And figured out grandkids are fun. So Joyce sent that email out and says, so what's their biggest problem for having a proper farm bill? And I looked at that and was, well, that's easy. Corporate agriculture money involved in developing farm policy. That's all it is, period. I see it every time I go to DC. It's the only reason we're planting fence row to fence row. That's the stupidest thing we've ever done. And there's nothing in the works to change it. You want to beat your head against the wall, check out an organization called CropLife America. You ever heard of them? Well, they have a $10 million operating budget annually. They have less than 30 members. 3 of their members pay 90% of their dues. And it was bad before in the USDA, but now if you start following the CropLife America connections into the people that are being hired on at the USDA now, it's gonna even be more prostituted. And so, that's my plug there. The last farm bill, we can't get enough money into the title programs of the farm bill to create an appropriate safety net for farmers. And that's what it was created for. That's what Franklin Roosevelt started the program for. It wasn't welfare, and it wasn't a subsidy. It was supposed to be inventory control to create a safety net that would not create crisis times like this in agriculture. I farmed through the 80s and barely survived. Maybe I'll survive this one, I don't know. And this is what you should have a farm bill there for. It should be for these times, not when you had freedom to farm and you had good prices and were getting record subsidies. That's what ruined the whole thing. And so we've got to get back to the real reason of why we need to have a farm bill. So in the last farm bill, National Farmers Union funded Dr. Del Rey to do an extensive study and analysis of the markets and what would be the best farm program, and it came back to inventory control. Yes, we want exports. We'll never export ourselves to prosperity, but it's inventory control, and I farmed under inventory control. It's nothing new. If there's too many crops out there, then you only plant 85% of your acres, and you do soil building crops on the others, and that just makes sense. And you'll never see that again. We put together a whole farm program that took less dollars out of the federal budget that would transition into inventory supply management, and by that create the farmers' prices for the marketplace, which is what it should be. And we could not get a single senator or a single congressman to carry that bill to the Hill. Not one. We've got the strongest allies in Washington, D.C. as a farm organization. Colin Peterson's a dear ally. From Minnesota, the senator. Dear Al Franken, dear ally. I mean, we've got the connections. We could not get a single congressman or a single senator to carry a supply management proposal to the Hill as a farm bill to work it. And so that's the frustrations you get. And so 2 weeks ago, we had our annual fly-in to Washington, D.C. We had a good team. Olivia was part of it. Usually Don Stoll's a part of it. He backed out on me this year, darn him. And we covered every congressional office and Senate office in Kansas, and to a person, everybody's fully acknowledged the fact that we're in a farm crisis right now, and yet nobody had an answer. And so when Will Stafford was sitting across from me in Senator Roberts' office, and Senator Roberts is very, very powerful in what the next farm bill is going to be. And Will just looked at me and he says, Don, you can do all the talking you want. There's going to be less money in this farm bill than there's going to be one than there was in the last one. And I told him, well, then we ain't going to have shit, because the last farm bill was worked at an all-time record high prices, and you never want to work a farm bill during a good farm economy. And this is about as crappy a farm economy as we can have, so it ought to be a good time to work a farm bill. And he says, well, that's what you're going to have. And so my analysis of what I understand and what I would gamble a little bit on is that I think we will have a farm bill. I think it'll be early next year, which is normally real shocking. I think it's going to happen. I think there's going to be less money than before. And I think that my guess is they're going to target their pick survivors in the future and funnel as much of the dollars that they can into that, and throw the rest of us in a milk bucket and a few coins and tell us to kill each other over it. That's what I think is going to happen. And so I'm a cynical old fart, but I've been around a long time. I don't see, conservation programs are excellent. Farmers Union policy, both state and federal, we support it well. And we want, conservation is good. And I'll be shocked if we see expanded money to it or even maintain what we have. I think, I'm even hearing rumors that right now the Farm Bill is actually broken into two different segments, and you had to choose at the beginning of the farm program, that cycle, whether you're going to do PLC or ARC, ARC or PLC. And PLC is the only one that has any type of a real safety net to it, and it's so far below break-even cost now, it's a joke as it is. There's rumors going around that they're going to try and rob PLC to fund ARC Stronger, so for their hand-picked survivors. So how's that for a cynical analysis of what I see? And I feel really inadequate here because these guys come so prepared. I just come to visit.
Now's your chance to see that you are one of the two best prepared and most articulate, intelligent of the three on the panel. I prepared a little bit, but first of all, I'd like to point out that there isn't anything that these two gentlemen have stated that I disagree with. I can't think of a single thing. Although our focus is slightly different, and I focus primarily on the conservation element of the Farm Bill and land use. Everything, I share all the thoughts that they share. And like Don, I grew up on a small farm northwest corner of the Flint Hills, and my sister and I still own it. And we manage it exclusively for grasslands, even though it had 112 acres of farmland at one time. It's all been put back into native vegetation. I'm going to try and see if the whole thing will qualify as pollinator habitat. I have 100 acres that's CRP, and I'd like to transform it into that more ecologically beneficial, because I think it would qualify right now. And I've just finished going through in USDA to create a wetland on the property, which is a direct benefit of one of these conservation programs. I've had in the last 20-some years an opportunity to become very familiar with farm programs. Started out with a base of knowledge coming from the farming community, or ranching/farming community. Then in the Clinton administration, I wanted to be on the state technical committee, which makes a lot of decisions and sets priorities and ranking criteria and funding levels and stuff for elements of the Environmental Quality and Scenic Program, which is EQIP. And along with Roger Wells, who was working at the time for Whale Unlimited, I asked the state conservationists if we could if we could become members of the state technical committee. And his slant was not very conservation oriented at the time, and he basically said no. Well, then I said, well, I'm going to talk to Dan Glickman, which I knew quite well. And he was Secretary of Agriculture at the time. And so they found a way to include us on the state technical committee. And I found it to be one of the most interesting and I wouldn't exactly say challenging, except challenging that you have to be there year after year after year after year to make significant changes in some of these specs and regulations and priorities and things. And it's been very encouraging. In some ways, I'd say I think I've accomplished maybe more in that capacity than in almost anything else that I've done. And we've seen a lot of improvements, and there are a number of people who are conservation elements. I mean, it's become much broader with conservation representation in recent years, and we have a critical mass. The only thing is that a lot of representatives of organizations and/or agencies don't speak up very much, and so you have to have somebody who is the troublemaker, and I qualify as a troublemaker in that capacity, as well as almost everything else I'm involved in. But I like it. A long time ago, I thought to myself, I can go home at night and regret that I didn't say anything in these settings, or I can go home at night and wonder if what I did was a little bit too hard-hitting. And I prefer the second choice. When it comes to defending wildlife and environmental resources, we have to do that. Joyce asked us to kind of articulate two things in looking at the program here tonight. One was what barriers to economic and ecological sustainability we see in the Farm Bill, in the upcoming Farm Bill, and in farming. And the other was if we could change the Farm Bill, which one item, or maybe a couple, would you select? After attending the first meeting this year of the Senate Ag Committee, which was chaired by Senator Roberts, and in Manhattan in late February, I articulated what I would like to see as changes in the Farm Bill. And some of these will not occur, but we have to have aspirations and work for things. Because if we don't work for them, they certainly won't occur. And I can remember when I was the sole voice in the coalition of conservation organizations pushing a grassland reserve program, and other organizations were either supportive or warm, but there were two organizations, farm organizations, that said, no, we don't want it because it'll deplete monies that are needed for other farm programs, commodity programs, essentially. Farm Bureau was one of those organizations. But if I were able, and I have copies of this that I wrote as an action alert at that time, end of February. If I had my magic wand, I would increase the Conservation Reserve Program, which is a program that basically rents land from landowners to plant, for the most part, native grasses in Kansas, and in some cases shrubs and trees, and to protect, to recreate habitats that hold the soil and provide habitat for wildlife. Originally, in 1985, it was created in part to help with the economic crisis, the farm crisis, when there were too many commodities and the prices were too low. And so it was at that particular time, the main emphasis was, let's take land out of production. And, but then the idea of it being positive to water quality and to wildlife, as well as soil erosion and reducing the surplus of commodities, all that came together. And it grew up to a program that allowed 39 million acres nationally. The last two farm bills have cut that back, and now it's $24 million. With emphasis on filter strips and field border strips and things like that are targeted in many cases for water quality improvement. I think the program would be very beneficial if it was increased to 34 million acres. And I think that'd be particularly important in places like the eastern Dakotas, where many of the lands around wetlands have been converted in recent years from grasslands to croplands. And so this was places where wetland birds, waterfowl, and things depend on these grassland habitats for nesting and brood rearing, and it's really important. The other thing that I would like to see returned to Kansas is returned into Farm Bill is the Grassland Reserve Program. This is an easement program where landowners can enter into an agreement with USDA to agree to never plow up their native grasslands, their prairies. And Kansas was the most successful state in implementing that program. And I think there's, I forget exactly how many acres, and I was going to look this up today to refresh my memory, that is in the program. I think it's around 40,000 acres or something. These are acres that, that for all practical purposes can never be destroyed. My wife and I had the very first Grassland Reserve Program easement accepted by USDA, and I'm very proud of that. Also was very proud of the fact that earlier I signed a conservation easement with Kansas Land Trust, which was when Joyce Wolf was the executive director, and that was the first conservation easement in the Flint Hills. And so, I think you got to walk the walk if you're going to advocate these sort of things, and I've always felt that necessary. Yeah, and so I'd like to see that program restored. The kind of program that has been replaced with is an easement program, agricultural lands conservation easement program, but they didn't sign up a single easement this last year because the requirements have been changed to make it far less feasible for it to occur. And an organization has to come up with basically half of the value of a conservation easement and buy it. And then the USDA will come up with the other half. But there aren't any, Jayhawk Audubon's not likely to come up with hundreds of thousands of dollars to buy easements or tens of thousands of dollars, so it just doesn't happen. And so it's a program that might have some merit in some places, but now it's very difficult to apply. In terms of the other thing that I would like to see established in a Farm Bill program that has never existed and has always been needed is to establish some kind of a biodiversity reserve program, something that protects the remaining, riparian forest and patches of special habitats and stuff that we have in the agricultural landscape that are just regarded by, in many cases, by the county assessor, in many cases by the loan agent who loans farmers money to operate or to buy land, or if you're to buy land and you go to Farm Credit Service to get a loan or something. They look at some of these lands and they classify them as wastelands. And they basically, if you want a loan, you're going to have to, produce on this land. It's not, you can't have places for quail and butterflies and all that sort of stuff. So everything goes against, especially when land changes hands, the prospect of these special areas being preserved. And I think that it's really tragic that we don't have some kind of a biodiversity program that subsidizes a landowner's interest in protecting natural areas within their agricultural landscape. We put lots of subsidies in the production lands. And if you tear these out, you can get subsidies for it then going forward, but not to preserve them. And out next to our sanctuary in Lincoln County over the last couple of years, we've seen a tragic example of this, where trees, oak trees that were very likely in existence when this state became a state, that have been bulldozed down into this low area and burned and stuff. Bur oak trees that are this big around. And I've got pictures of them to prove it. I've laid a shovel over the stump and stuff like that. The other thing in a farm bill that I hope is preserved is the 5% of the funds for the Environmental Quality Incentive Program allocated nationally for wildlife conservation. Because in many places that is used very effectively, but not in Kansas. In Kansas, we turned back primarily because of Robin Jennison, the Secretary of the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks and Tourism, about $600,000 of that $900,000 that we're eligible for in Kansas. He will not, for example, use those funds to support conservation of shortgrass species associated with prairie dog colonies, which is black-footed ferrets. Eastern Oklahoma, or eastern Colorado utilizes it, but Robin Jennison says, some of my friends wouldn't like that. I'm illustrating, I'm not quoting him, but $600,000 for wildlife conservation is just turned away because of his political view, and he will not allow this agency to move forward in that regard. Whereas Eastern Colorado works with ranchers to do this, and they establish these black-footed ferret areas where they work with the ranchers to preserve prairie dogs and also control prairie dogs around the boundaries for the benefit of black-footed ferrets, burrowing owls, swift foxes, ferruginous hawks, golden eagles, and all these other species, including amphibians and reptiles, that depend upon prairie dog colonies. Prairie dog colonies are kind of like wetlands in that in the prairie, which you have a whole suite of other forms of life associated with them that you wouldn't find on the surrounding prairie, at least to the same extent. And I've been an advocate of that for quite a while, and keep harping on that. One of the, it was mentioned that, Paul mentioned that 6% of the Farm Bill funding goes to conservation. But some of that, if you take a closer look, as you would if you were on this state technical committee, a lot of what is under the conservation category is not really conservation. The biggest amount of money associated with grasslands is gone for a thing called brush management. It used to be called brush control, but in deference to me, I think they call it brush management now, because I've been on this for a number of years, and I've been very much concerned, and I encourage you to pick up a copy of this magazine. On page 19 is an article about how the money is used to, in many cases, aerially apply Agent Orange to grasslands in the Flint Hills and other places. It used to be Agent Orange, I don't know. It's not precisely the same thing as what they used in Vietnam now. It was early on in the 70s. And I lived in Alma, and I went to a state in the early 1970s, and I went to a county conservation committee meeting, and they were talking about all the great things they've done. And for one of the things that just blew me out of my chair was the chairman of the county committee, who was a herbicide dealer and a chemical dealer from Harveyville, said, we have treated 88,000 acres in Waubonsee County, grasslands and forest lands and woodlands and stuff with these herbicides. And I have all kinds of pictures from my archives way back then. Big oak trees and all kinds of things sprayed. Now, there's still an awful lot of practices that I really don't consider to be conservation practices funded in EQIP. They are really indirect production practice, indirect support of production practices. I have a neighbor in Pottawatomie County who just put in a huge feedlot on top of the hills in the Flint Hills. Several $100,000 of EQIP money went in to build what should be, he should have paid for himself, is the ponds for collecting all the runoff from this, 5,000 to 10,000 cow feedlot operation. We subsidize it, that sort of thing. The same thing is true for hog confinement operations in Washington County that I'm familiar with, and other things of this nature. A lot of this, is not what it's cut out to represent. Fortunately, we've made some changes now. You can't use them for new feedlots. They can only help correct the older ones that are established that are polluting. Although the state of Kansas right now basically doesn't have much demand for projects of that nature, to improve pollution problems from feedlots and confined livestock or poultry operations, because the state of Kansas has a philosophy right now from the top, which is don't see any evil, don't hear any evil, don't speak any evil. The water quality laws are not really followed, are really not pursued at this time to the extent that they used to be. So they don't need that so much. Maybe we'll have some discussions here. One of the other questions was about the economics of sustainability, and my view is exactly the same as these two gentlemen, and that is, unfortunately, Farm Bill and other associated subsidy programs such as ethanol mandates and subsidies that they've had in the past go to prop up and build the capital of the large operations. It's disproportionately much more favorable oriented to these big operations. And so as they get more money and have more federal funds coming from them and other funds, then they buy up much of the farmland, so that the little guy, the family farm operator, cannot compete with big corporate-like or industrial farming operations. And so we're losing the culture of our rural landscape as well, because we don't have near as many families living on the land as if we would if we produced the more diverse crops and livestock operations, and it didn't all become industrialized. Speaking of butterflies and your painted ladies, we've had a lot of painted ladies this year. They grow on the larvae have really taken advantage of soybeans, by the way. And you see some soybean fields where the leaves are just all riddled with holes. Most of it, they haven't really destroyed the production very much of soybeans, but that's where a lot of them are being raised. But when I noticed a bunch of painted ladies on some of our plants in the country, I thought to myself, well, heck, there's so many interesting things named after ladies, but very few things named after men, man of war or something. But I have had naked ladies in the yard at that time, and painted ladies on the country, and then every morning I'd have an elegant lady with my cereal. Those are peaches. That's probably all this you can handle.
Are you ready to take some questions?
Good. I did think of another comment I'd like to make.
Oh, go ahead and do that. The only thing I want to do is make sure when we start questions because this is being recorded, please, somebody with a microphone, repeat the question before you answer.
Can you bleep out certain things?
I like a two-way dialogue, so if anybody got questions, holler out. I complete ignorance. One thing that I wanted to point out about Joyce then said, you know, what do we need to do to make a better farm bill in her questions? And one of the things that frustrates me so much is everything's tied to bushels. And so when you're talking about price support programs now, it's paid on per bushel, not per acre. And so it's just like planting fence row to fence row. The incentive this way is maximum production, maximum inputs, because the government payments are paid on a per bushel price support. And so that's to be an easy fix in a normal world. And then, you know, I'm passionate about climate change, and so I just think it would be so wonderful if we would start focusing our agricultural subsidies toward practices and crops that sequester carbon. And so if we change the focus from basic commodities to things that are good for environment and for society, I'd like to see that.
I just want to say one thing. Go ahead. Jennifer. It's Jennifer, right?
Right.
Right.
I was just wondering if you could describe what the current farm crisis is like. I know that there's a crisis. I'm not sure I know that I have all the information on the details for why there is one and who are the people being affected.
It's across the board, which is really weird. I mean, dairy sucks.
Please repeat the question.
Very good. The question was, could you explain the farm crisis and how bad it is, or is it? And it's across the board. Prices on the grain crops are down a third of what they were 3 years ago. 3 Januaries ago, my January calf crop that I sold brought a dollar figure. The next year, it was $70,000 for 54 calves. And the next year, it was $45,000. This last year, it was $30,000. So it's less than half of what I got 3 years ago. And you can't pay the bills that way. And so what happens is this becomes an accumulating thing, because when you farm, you put a lot of money into taking care of a cow herd for a whole year, or putting in your crops, and you borrow on that all year long, but at the end of the year, you kind of pay the banker off, everybody's happy. Well, 1 year don't work, and you go, well, that kind of sucks. And the banker goes, yeah, we'll see how things go another time. And then you get 2 years in a row, and then it's really bad. If it's 3 years in a row, it's disastrous. And right now, the FDIC is advising ag bankers to crank down on their credit, and maybe that's appropriately so, but you caught me in the bind. I'm about as savvy out there as you can get. If I don't figure out some funding by next year, I won't be here next year. It's that bad, and I've been here for 60 years. And so it's bad. I don't know how to soften it, or I don't want to sit up here and whine about it either. But those years of me traveling the state and working farmers' books, you know, every time you want to talk about a farm program and family farmers and how we do this, almost every farm I work, the difference between having a farm that cash flowed enough to convince a banker to lend him money another year and having a farm that didn't cash flow was the government payment. That just almost year in and year out, that's the way it was. And we 20 acres of CRP, none of that was renewed, been in for 20 years. There were 25 contracts up for renewal in Potawatomi County, 2 were accepted for renewal. Marshall County had a worse ratio than that, Washington County was worse than that. CRP is actually a pretty good program, and most of that didn't get renewed as being cropped. I needed more grass, I've got cows on mine, but that's the exception rather than the rule.
When did it expire for CRP?
This is the first year that I grazed it.
Okay, so last
Yeah,
December?
or last October, yes.
Oh, one of the things though is that there was a while when some entities in agriculture were making a heck of a lot of money, you know, particularly larger operations. And if you only took 50 or 75 calves in, you're not a very big operation in today's.
Well, I got 2 herds, so.
2 herds.
So I got about
100 cows, but it takes about 200 just to have a sustainable, a supportive kind of operation almost, I think.
argue more like
400, okay, it's jumped up. But, you know, I think that one of the things we should keep in mind and is that we can go to a lot of places, and these are the larger farmer operations, and you'll see a number of vehicles, pickup trucks and stuff that the teenage sons have, that $60,000 sitting around and so on and so forth. And it's hard for a person to say, well, they need more government subsidies when you see that sort of thing in many cases. When salaries for the working class, other working class people have also been down as their costs have gone up. So it's a crisis, farm crisis that doesn't end at the farmer's boundary, in my opinion. It's kind of a lot of it throughout the country right now.
Okay, but to expand on that a little bit, a lot of times you got to look at the non-farm money that's coming into those operations too. And some of them are, there's very large operations, and there's good families in our area that are much bigger than me. I work off the farm. I mean, I'm traveling more than I'm home, so about 100 cows is all I can handle. But the way the tax structure is with depreciation, and there was a couple of good years of farming there, and just a couple, but this was one of the saddest things that I'm seeing in my experience as I travel the state is the fact that this was the first time that I can recall since the 70s that young people could look at the farm and say, maybe I can go and make a living there and be socially equal to my urban neighbors. And we had a young generation coming back, and they made good money for a couple of years, and they were arrogant, and they never thought it'd go down again. We had a new plateau, and us old farts knew better. But thing is, when you make some good money, you're going to pay taxes on it unless you go buy paint and iron. And so you go buy a piece of iron so you don't have to pay it to the government, and so you can depreciate it off of your taxes. But you still got to pay for that piece of iron for years to come. You don't pay for that piece of iron in 1 year. So right now, all these kids that's jumped in with both feet have all this green paint and all that iron, and they got to figure out how to pay for it, and they can't do it now. And so we're going to lose another young generation through this, and that's the saddest thing of all. I'll be all right. I've been around long enough. I'll be okay. But I don't know that I want to encourage my sons to take this on, you know?
The other thing is, though, is that this may be a situation where more land gets acquired by the larger operators. Absolutely. You know, and we just keep getting into these ups and downs, and every down, you know, the smaller operators lose out, and the bigger ones, you know. I think there was one crop that Paul didn't mention that's subsidized. At least it used to be. I haven't kept up on it, but he mentioned soybeans and corn and cotton and stuff. But did you mention sugar? There's a lot of sugar growers that were getting, you know, as many as $7 million.
Sugar self-funded program. It's not
Now,
funded by the taxpayer.
They've taken that off now, because it was a kind of a poster boy for abuse of this, subsidy programs for a while.
We do have a question over here.
I will. A couple more comments. I'm a vegetable farmer, so I don't deal with the kind of markets that Don does, et cetera. But what does concern me in trying to study this is, especially I've learned a lot from the Organization for Competitive Markets, which has done a really analysis of the agribusiness entities that are really taking control of our markets. So the beef industry, there are 4 firms at this point that control 85% of the beef market at this point. So there are feedlots all over the state that are only getting 1 bid from a packer. And when you talk about the crash in cattle prices that's happened in the last 3 or 4 years, that hasn't shown up necessarily at the supermarket.
Oh, absolutely not.
I mean, it's squeezing. Walmart now sells 25% of the groceries in our country at this point. We have a handful of supermarkets. I mean, it's like a funnel. You've got this many farmers, and you bring it down, to just a narrow number of producers or sellers, and then to consumers. And it's like a glass, hourglass. Thank you. And until we have that debate, and we're on the verge of watching, right now we have 6 major agrochemical and seed companies in this country, in the world, I guess, and we're watching 6 of them turn into 3. DuPont and Dow are our thing. Kim China bought Syngenta, and now we're debating whether Monsanto is going to get bought by Bayer. And in the 1980s, you paid $8 for a bag of soybeans. Today, you pay $60 for it. I mean, the squeeze is on for who's going to be out producing. And at this point, I think the last numbers I saw from the Federal Reserve Bank in Kansas City is that 40% of our farmland is now farmed by non-owners. And there is speculation going on by insurance and venture capitals, et cetera, to buy land in our country. So if they can't cash flow it in real terms off of what you can really make off the land, and you have to use other tax and mechanisms to do it, I mean, farmers are going to struggle too, especially if we want that next generation of beginning farmers to take hold at this point. Sorry about that.
Do companies like Cargill or Archer Daniels Midland have any significant influence on farm policy?
Yes. Significant, yes. I mean, the gentleman that created the ADM empire just passed away here about 6 months ago. Yeah. And in his obituary, it talked about his funding. It was his dollars in Nixon's safe that created the Watergate scandal, blah, blah, blah. But anyhow, he just openly stated, he says, I always get back a lot more than I pay in. He just considered it tithing. Yeah. If you ain't, if you can't pay, you don't play. On Capitol Hill, man. I'm sorry?
The dairy program, isn't that heavily subsidized?
I'm awfully glad I don't know, because we sold our dairy here in '94 when I went to K-State. I had a really happy wife after that. But those poor dairy farmers, I had no idea how they make a living for what they get for their milk. The support system that's supposed to be there now, the farm, whatever you call it, it's like the crop farms. The support price is so low below production costs that if it gets to that point, then it's already too late. So, yeah.
To the point of only 4 meat packers or
Do antitrust laws come into play at all?
You wanna get
The question,
over here?
right, the question is antitrust laws or that, are they enforced in terms of market manipulation and that? And the simple answer is no. And I think, and I could turn to Don Stahl, he could help me with some of this as well, but my non-lawyer understanding of all of this is that antitrust really comes into play if you can really show a detriment to the consumer specifically. And what's not laid out in some antitrust law is what happens to the producers get squeezed in the process. And so they're kind of the producers are kind of the casualties in this war. And so unless you can show definitive illegal pricing that impacts consumers, but is that a fair statement?
Very fair. I don't mean to dominate the microphone here. You get tired of listening to me holler at me. I want to share JBS. They're the big dog out there right now. JBS is a Brazilian company.
How many have heard of JBS? I know some of these advocates have here, but
What kind of company is JBS?
I'm sorry?
What kind of company is JBS?
It's a corporation. I mean,
That's what?
they own over 50% of the meat processing in American beef. But the thing is, they also own Five Rivers Feedlot. And I serve on the USDA Farmer and Rancher Advisory Board, and we haven't had a meeting since the election. That may never happen again. But anyhow, a year ago, we were out on the JBS feedlot in Greeley, Colorado. And the feedlot manager was very open, a good old cowboy. That particular feedlot had 96,000 head in it. JBS is a Brazilian company, and Batista Brothers, and usually when you have a feedlot, you own 10%, you have other people own 90% of the animals, you custom feed them for them. He said that in that feedlot and in all of the Five Rivers feedlots, they own 90% of the animals in that feedlot. And so only 10% are custom fed. The financing for the feedlot system of Five Rivers Feedlot in North America has one-time feeding capacity of 1 million head. So at any given moment, they have 1 million head of steers being finished out in North America. And so what do you cycle this feedlot? 2.5 times? But anyhow, any one time, they can have 1 million head. The investment company that owns those cattle is out of Brazil. And it's not JBS, but it's another one they set up to fund all these cattle. And this feedlot manager says every week they get a call from Brazil and they tell them what they want on their return on their money, and that's how he back calculates what he can pay for that animal coming into the lot. And that's my calf that's going into that lot, And so when you hear about all this corruption going on in Brazil right now, that's affecting my cattle prices. And if you watch the news a little closer, it's all about the Batista Brothers is what's broke that whole economic thing down there. And this is going to come back and affect our cattle market in America for some time to come.
JBS also owns Pilgrims.
Really?
They're the
Yeah.
number one beef producer in the world. They also are they're fast chasing down Tyson's as the number one chicken producer. So they own Pilgrims. They are forced to divest of Five Rivers. And part of the Batista Brothers, as you well know, are now poking for serious bribery in Brazil. And they are
JBS was just fined $3.2 billion a few months ago for political corruption. And they just jailed the CEO of JBS. And when you think that they're one of the 4 beef companies that control, food sovereignty is an issue that really needs a much broader debate in our country. Smithfield Farms, which was the largest pork producer in the United States, 18 months ago was bought by a Chinese firm. And so now 1 out of every 4 hogs in the United States is Chinese owned. Do we care where your bacon comes from?
Yes.
These entities though lobby against food sovereignty and make it so that they want to make it illegal, and Congress is cooperative to try and identify the origin of your meat. I don't think that there is at present time any labeling of origin, is there?
Yeah, they got it killed.
They got that
You
killed.
know where your mattress comes from, you don't know where your food comes
Yes, ma'am.
I was going to mention, do you know some of the Sahara Club's research looking at, they were looking at the burning techniques of the prairie that were done for intensive grazing for the big lots. And it was really particularly interesting. It was specific to Kansas, too, with how much particulate, and that's blowing our way, too, and K-State helped do the research on this vast intensive burning, it's for the feedlots. So I was just going to ask if any of you could comment on that, because the Sahara Club at least has that out there for us to see locally. But I want to throw one more point out, because I'm from Wisconsin, and I'm from Wisconsin, and so I saw more of, one of the bigger issues is, and I know this state does it too, the whole government does it, is they let agriculture get away with a lot of things. It's not regulated. Even up in Wisconsin, they're going to solve these big vats of manure and urine by saying, now we're going to aerial spray it as a fertilizer. It's very polluting, but actually it's not regulated. It's under a lot less regulation. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Not specifically in terms of the manure in Wisconsin.
Well,
I try to stay out of that.
You can take that data, because I've seen it out of, I'm just saying I've seen it out of Arkansas,
yeah.
I've seen it out of there, and I've seen Sahara Club mostly look closely at it, and then it just isn't regulated. That's the point I'm making, so.
Well, burning, they're making progress in Kansas in terms of timing of burning and trying to get it taken out. Unfortunately, the way custom grazing occurs in the Flint Hills, it's more profitable to get more quick weight gains if you burn. And from the standpoint of those of us in conservation, we would like to see, a third of it burned every year rather than all burned, almost, in some cases every year, all burned, because of the fact that there's so much landscape burning. There's other lands that should be burned that are not being burned, that are growing up in cedar trees in the northern Flint Hills and on the fringes of the Flint Hills and stuff. But burning has its place, but it may be a bit overdone. It is overdone, and that's resulted in declines in greater prairie chickens and other grassland birds and stuff. And so it's tough to convince managers of ranchers that they should do it different. It's more difficult to burn a third and leave 2/3 every year and then rotate it around. One would think that with some of the wealthier owners of ranch land in the Flint Hills, who are really corporate leaders, that they could afford not to try and maximize their beef production, but they hire ranch managers who, that is their paradigm, is trying to produce as much beef and put as many pounds on as is possible in 90 days. And spring burning helps facilitate that. But if we could just get to a lot of these landowners to say, hey, we'd like you to care about prairie chickens and such too.
Quick comment on that. I burn a lot, and I don't do a thing about burning for production. Everything for me is brush control. East of the Flint Hills, we're a forest ecosystem. If I can't control it with fire, I gotta control it with chemicals. I much rather burn it. That's only a week out of the year. I consider the Sierra Club a pretty strong ally most of the time, on both here and on the national level, but I keep telling them, you go after my fire stick and we're gonna go to war. Because it's just such an important tool in this part of Kansas.
I attended several of the town halls of Senator Moran, and I'm from the Flint Hills, so we have Representative Roger Marshall has been holding town halls, and because of the political situation right now, the town halls have been very contentious, but I noticed they all, or both of them, work really hard to present themselves as friends of agriculture. So I'm just thinking there have to be more small family farmers who vote than there are big corporate executives who may not even live in Kansas. So what's going on here? I'm learning from you, and thank you very much. It's so enlightening what you've said, that there's a huge discrepancy between how they portray themselves and what's actually happening. Because you're saying you're not finding an advocate in Washington at all.
Follow the money.
I think that, especially considering the political scenario in the last few years, they got us fighting each other, tooth and nail. And it isn't us against them, it's the haves against the have-nots. It's 1% against the 99%. They just got us fighting each other. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer than that. Joyce?
My question is similar to Margie's, is that if more people, non-farm people, people like all of us here, would write to or call their senators, Moran and Roberts, supporting small family farms rather than corporate. I mean, I keep hearing the other part of this is that as we lose farmers, the rural communities are dying.
It's true.
Would it make a difference if enough of us got involved? Non-farmers, but advocating for small farmers.
I've often made the comment, if the consumers would get pissed off, things would change overnight. It wouldn't be coming from Congress, it'd be coming from Walmart and Dillon's. And that's how we got rid of RBST. We couldn't do it through the government. Dillon's could. And you're exactly right. But it's just amazing how they can sugarcoat things and make it look like they're doing the right thing. Yes, sir.
Joyce, I think we need a broader agricultural debate than we've had in Kansas. And I think, as Don says, as consumers, you probably may well do more with your consumer dollar than you may ever do at the ballot box. But I mean, the rural centers looked at regional and local foods in some depth, and I mean, we import 96% of all the produce that we eat in the state of Kansas at this point. So, and when you're talking about western Kansas, like Marshall's district, they've watched a vast number of their small county seats have lost their only grocery store. About a fourth of the cities in Kansas. We go back in 2010, we had 320 cities in our state that had a grocery store. We've lost 90 of those since 2010, all of them in towns 2,500 or less. So they're driving to Salina or to Hayes or to Goodland or whatever, to that Walmart or whatever, or Dillon's. And if you talk about viability of expanding rural areas in Kansas, a debate about a food system has to go with that, along with affordable housing too. Yes?
From what you've said this evening, it appears there's a systemic corruption in the agriculture policy industry in this country. And I'm just wondering why RICO statutes don't come into play at some point. It seems as though that line is being approached.
I don't know.
I don't have that kind of technical or legal understanding to be able to comment on that. I don't know if Ron does, but I mean, I'd go back to that question about why we've given up antitrust enforcement in our country. You know, where has the debate gone with conservatives and people who believe that the free market is our biblical God-given 10 Commandments? How do we sit and watch? We've got 4 or 5 banks that control the vast amount of wealth. We've got 4 airlines. We've got, you know, we're headed for 3 agrochemical firms. I mean, at some point, where do we get back to a more vibrant market economy? That conservatives have said, you know, that's how, you know, the world should work. And it's just a blind eye.
Those of you interested in issues of trust and antitrust and monopolistic practices, please go to the website of Organization for Competitive Markets, better known as OCM. And it is an organization founded in 1998 dedicated to trying to reverse the trend toward monopolies, especially in food and agriculture. There is a suit now in Oklahoma by poultry growers suing all of the big poultry firms over issues of I don't know if they're using RICO, but they're charging them all with conspiracy to fix the pricing paid to chicken farmers, chicken growers. So, Organization for Competitive Markets dot. I guess it's
That was competitive-markets.org.
It's OCM.org.
Sure.
Since all of you think the Farm Bill is kind of a useless vehicle for some of the things that you want to accomplish, like supporting vegetable farmers versus the commodities. But all of you think that the Farm Bill at this point is a useless vehicle for doing what you want to do in terms of conservation or supporting vegetable farmers as opposed to the commodities. So is there any other vehicle for getting that done at the state or federal level? Another piece of legislation, another policy tweak that might accomplish what you can't accomplish with the Farm Bill?
Well, the question is, if the Farm Bill is not the vehicle to make certain changes for a better food system or better health, what other opportunities are out there? You know, I'll go back and repeat myself. Part of it's consumer demand, that, you know, consumers willing, you know, are looking for local food, willing to pay a little more at times, you know, farmers markets, et cetera. That's part of it. Part of it started here in Douglas County 10 years ago with the Food Policy Council that has been stellar at raising the debate and talking about what opportunities they've got through the Food Hub. And Kansas now has, out of 105 counties, 31 counties that have local food councils at this point. That's part of the debate. Part of the debate's when, you know, it's talking about closed rural grocery stores, that's generated interest by certain communities to get on board. How we elevate that into Pat Roberts' bunker, or I don't know. You know, I want to be more hopeful with Jerry Moran, and he's sitting there with controlling agricultural appropriations that will go through Congress, and he's worked on some on conservation programs in the past. So if there's the approachable senator, I want to believe, at this point.
I like Senator Moran has a soul. There's We get along pretty well together. I like Senator Moran. I just don't get the votes out of him.
Jerry, are we gonna wrap this up, or?
Yes, so, thank you very much.